Hey, how you doing? You know who this is. You should by now. It's Steve Sims with another episode of The Art of Making Things Happen, the podcast. We have Weldon Long on here. Now, you may not have heard of Weldon. He's been in prison a ton, and he's a hugely successful coach, speaker, author. The guy's got some focus on him. I love what he does with the books. I love the work that he's done and how he recognizes his darkest hours were actually some of his silver linings. But learn from his mistakes. Learn from people that do things badly that then were able to allow it to refine them and not define them and then adopt that skill set. You got a lot of nuggets in this podcast. So listen, learn, do something with it and enjoy. Hey, Weldon, welcome to the show.
Awesome to be here, Steve. I really appreciate you having me.
Now, you're very successful. A lot of people out there, like most people on podcasts, there are some people that know you, some people have never heard of you, but afterwards they're going to be a fan of you as you're a very successful speaker, coach on prosperity, sales, mindset. And I want to pick on a couple of those words to start off with.
Okay.
We had someone a while ago teaching about sales, but people find sales and prosperity dirty words and dirty subjects.
Yeah.
Why is it, do you feel, we're actually alienated from actually discussing, for the first thing, prosperity? Why is that something we don't want to talk about?
You know, it's interesting because I think with respect to prosperity in particular, I think for Americans, a lot of what we've learned about wealth creation, prosperity, success is kind of rooted in the Great Depression because we're all a couple of generations removed from somebody who lived through it. And what did people learn during the Great Depression? Well, I can tell you that my grandfather learned that he hated rich people. And he taught that to my father. When I was growing up, my dad used to always say rich people were crooks. And I always wondered why he said that. And then he'd say things like, who do you think we are, the Rockefellers? And I'd be like, who the hell are the Rockefellers? Well, as I grew up and understood, the Rockefellers are one of the wealthy families in the Great Depression, along with the Fords and J.P. Morgan and Getty and all those people and Carnegie. And so when we were in the Great Depression, when our forefathers, our fathers and grandfathers, I guess, were in the Great Depression, we had a name for the wealthy people. And it was a derogatory term. It was the robber barons, remember? Right? The poor people like my family, you might be a Rothschild or something or a Vanderbilt, but my family was poor. And so we grew up with a poor mindset. My grandparents were poor. They grew up in the Great Depression. They learned that rich people were crooks. They were robber barons. And that infected the entire mindset of our family. I can remember my other grandfather, my mother's father. We would have a big meal with the family around for Thanksgiving. Mom and grandma would cook a big meal and he would say a blessing. And then he would say, look how good the po folk is eating tonight, right? Like we defined ourselves as the poor folk. And so it's no wonder so many of us have this scarcity mentality as if there's something wrong with being wealthy and successful. I think from a very early age, we're just imprinted with this, wealth is a bad thing or money is the root of all evil, all those kinds of things. And I think it just develops over the course of the first 15, 20 years of our lives. And we get this, many people anyway, get this mindset that there's, wealth is not really an honorable thing to pursue.
So it's hereditary, that affliction to it. But surely there's nothing smarter. And I think it also comes down to the room you're in. And I think it was quite noticeable for me because I grew up with no money. Now I get into rooms where I can openly talk about money and how to keep it, retain it, make more of it. It's a conversation I want to have. It's like you having, an ailment or a sickness. You want to be able to talk to your doctor about it so it can be cured.
Right.
So you don't have that problem again. How do we overcome the mindset and having an open conversation on wealth, prosperity, holding on to your money, being able to distribute and grow it? Yeah. How do we change our mindset on that?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is what you just said, right? You've heard that old saying that we're the average of the 5 people that we hang out with. So I think part of it's hanging out with a different group of people. I like to, if we're the average of the 5 people that we hang out with most, I want to be the lowest common denominator in that 5. I want to be with people that are more successful than me that can hopefully educate me and help me. But I think the other thing, it's a big part of a book that I wrote a number of years ago called The Power of Consistency. And that book's a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller. And I think it's done so well because it's such a simple idea. And that is that we can change our conditioning of our mind. We can grow new neural pathways. And so what I teach is basically to get crystal clear specificity, get specific clarity on what you want in terms of income, wealth production, whatever. Write it down and then write out 2 or 3 things that you got to do every single day to make that thing happen, and then review it in what I call a quiet time ritual for 10 or 15 minutes every morning. And basically what happens is that we begin to recondition our subconscious mind with, positive thoughts, positive habitual thoughts about money, about earning income and that type of thing. So it's a process. I think that we can change our mindset. We can change our habitual thoughts. The key, however, is to identify the limiting beliefs that we might have got from our grandparents or parents or somebody else along the way, and identifying those so that we can deal with them. Because if we don't acknowledge they're there, if we don't even know it's a problem, obviously you can't fix it.
How old are you, Weldon?
I am 59 next month.
All right, congratulations for a start and early happy birthday. So you're 59 years old and you started off as one of those, in your terms, and I apologize about the accent, po folk, which I absolutely love that term. What point of your life did you suddenly go, whoa, hang on a minute, I'm being held back by this mentality. I need to change it. Where were you and how old are you?
Well, I was 32 years old. It was on June 10th of 1996, and I was in federal prison. I know exactly the day it happened because it was that moment of clarity in my life. I dropped out of high school when I was after ninth grade. I started running the streets and started getting in trouble when I was in my early 20s. And in 1987, I was drunk and high on cocaine one night and pulled a gun on a guy and got sentenced to prison. I did about 4.5 years. I got out. Now I'm a high school dropout and a convicted felon, started defining myself as a loser and just seeing myself that way. 2 years later, I'm back in prison for gun charges and parole violations. Only went back for about 2 years. I got lucky. I got out again at 30 years old and couldn't find work, hooked up with some guys out in Las Vegas doing some sketchy telemarketing until one day the feds came in. I went to federal prison for 7 years on federal mail fraud and money laundering charges. And just at the beginning, that was in 1996. In March of 1996, I was indicted and arrested. In June of 96, on June 10th, my father died at 59 years old, by the way. So I'm a little nervous about next year if you catch my drift. But unexpectedly, a heart attack. And when my dad died, the realization hit me that my dad went to his grave with me in prison again. I was a punk. I was a thug. I was a knucklehead. I also, by that time in the story, had a 3-year-old son that I had fathered when I was out on parole. So I had abandoned my own flesh and blood. And on June 10th, when I received the news that my dad had just died, I just realized, the scales came off and all the rationalization stopped, the justifications, and I saw myself for the first class POS that I was. And I decided that day I was going to make a change. And I had 7 years left to go in prison. And so I began to study and read about the prosperity mindset, the millionaire mindset, kind of think and grow rich type of stuff. I started studying business and sales. I learned most of what I learned in sales the first 7 years was I learned in books in prison from Tom Hopkins and Brian Tracy and, all the legendary guys. And then 7 years later, I walked out of prison and I had a whole different mindset. I had a mindset. I had studied what successful people do. And my plan was to do that, And so in January of 2003, so 20 years ago next month, I got out of prison for the last time and was living in a homeless shelter. Got a job selling air conditioners, took about 6 months. I was good at it. I had this new mindset. A year later, I opened my own company. And 5 years later, I sold that. It was hit Inc. 5000 status. We sold it. I started writing books and speaking, consulting, and I've owned several other companies in their interim. So it was really, for me, it was a very clear demarcation in my life. There was before June 10th, 1996, and there was after. And the after is a hell of a lot better.
Now, the funny thing is, great story, great reason, but you skipped over something that so many people get hung up on. You said, well, I learned about everything and then I got it and I did it. How many people actually get scared of actually taking the action on the information that they've got? You took action. You spent all of that time reading the books you need to read, from people you need to listen to. It boggles me why people turn around and go, well, I didn't do. How stupid do you need to be to actually ignore the information you need in order to have the life you wanted?
Right.
Did you find it hard to take that action?
Initially, I think because I was so embedded in a certain lifestyle in prison and all that kind of stuff. And it was a strong gravitational pull to break out of that. But what you say is so true. I believe that one of the definitions of insanity is finding something that works and not doing it. And, as I often say, that the success is not a knowledge problem. It's an implementation problem. We all pretty much know what we need to do. If you don't know, you can read a couple of books and figure it out. It ain't rocket science. But it's an implementation problem. People just don't do it. And in my mindset process, it's based on the acronym of FEAR, FEAR, focus, emotional commitment, action, and responsibility. And so action is a huge component of what I call the prosperity mindset. Some call the millionaire mindset, whatever. It's all the same thing. We've got to take consistent action. But this is where Mother Nature can be really helpful. I talked about writing things down, and I teach this prosperity plan where you identify what you want in 3 key areas of your life: your financial situation, your profession, your financial security, your relationships, and your health. Identify what you want with clarity in each of those areas. Write down 2 or 3 things that you have to do each day to achieve those things, and then review them every day in what's called a quiet time ritual. 10 to 15 minutes visualizing, reading, reviewing those things, right? What that does, that conditions the mindset, the subconscious mind, for a certain expectation. And then you look at the consistency principle that says public declarations, private declarations dictate future action. So let's say I'm reviewing I'm a professional salesperson. I'm reviewing my prosperity plan, and I say I earn $300,000 per year. What do I got to do? I mean, it's different for everybody, but let's say I run every call with passion and purpose. I diagnose problems, recommend solutions like a boss, and I ask for the order every single time. If I just do those 3 things on every single call, I'm probably going to be pretty successful in sales, right? And I review it, I visualize it every morning. And then 2 hours later, I go out and I drop off a proposal, and I don't do any of those things. I just walk in, I chicken out, I drop off the number, hope they call me back. Well, what's going to kick in is something called cognitive dissonance. Dissonance is the anxiety we feel between what we said we would do and what we actually do. As humans, we want our words and our behaviors to be in alignment, right? That's called resonance. We're at peace with ourselves. When you say one thing and do something else, you're in a state of dissonance. The human condition hates dissonance. So if you review this every single day, eventually those behaviors, you'll start driving those behaviors because you can't live in dissonance forever. It'll make you crazy. So 1 of 2 things will eventually happen. Eventually, I'll start running every call with passion and purpose, diagnosing, recommending like a boss, and asking for the order. Or to get back to a state of resonance, I have to throw the plan away and forget thinking about it every morning. Because you simply cannot tell yourself you're going to be a certain way every single morning and then go out there and be somebody else and not make yourself crazy. So ultimately, my hope is that people continue to review their dreams, their hopes, their goals, and that eventually the dissonance starts driving those behaviors. Because as you know, if you engage in the behaviors, success is pretty much guaranteed eventually, right? Eventually, if you keep doing the right things, I tell people, if you do the right things, you think the right things, you're going to produce the right results. You cannot be thinking the right things and doing the right things every day and accidentally produce the wrong results. It just doesn't work that way.
Why is the big question. Now, this may, and I'm just trying to aggravate and poke the bear a little bit here,
Yeah.
but you had a rough, wild, inconsistent, or maybe consistently bad choice life that got you locked up for a few times. And then you came out of that with a mindset. And I think, I go to prison, I think 3 times a year with Define. We communicate and train entrepreneurs in training, EIT, through Defy inside. And I love going in there. My son supports it as well. But you didn't have any future had you not created it yourself.
Right.
And then you did. And you dominated and you owned it. What was the switch that flicked that went, okay, I did it for myself. I've now got to teach other people to do it. Because no one would have held you selfish. No one would have had a go at you. You turned your life around. But for some people, they can teach. You're a very well-known speaker and coach. But there was a lot of people that can do it but can't teach. There's a lot of people, sadly, that teach that freaking shouldn't. But what was the switch in you that said, hey, I'm obligated to tell people how to do it themselves? Why?
Yeah. I remember reading a quote one time from Tolstoy. And Tolstoy said that service is the true meaning of life. And this has become more and more clear to me as I get older. I think as you get older, you start coming to terms with your mortality, that it's not going to last forever. And we start thinking about legacy and those types of things. And what I realize in my work is how important contribution is and making a contribution. And it satisfies the soul. If you look back to Dr. Stephen Covey called it the 8th habit. Maslow calls it the hierarchy of needs, but at the top of that pyramid is this concept of self-actualization that we all crave, or many of us crave. Let me put it that way. And that self-actualization is the contribution. The legendary Tony Robbins, who I've been a fan of for 40 years, Tony endorsed my first book, The Upside of Fear. And when he sent the endorsement, he said, "Congratulations on your turnaround from prison to contribution." He didn't say from prison to a Ferrari. He didn't say from prison to a house in Maui. He said from prison to contribution. And I remember reading that. That was 15 years ago. And I'm like, wow, man, that contribution thing. And I learned more from Dr. Covey, who was a friend of mine, a mentor, from all these really successful people. Tom Hopkins, who's a dear friend of mine. He actually wrote the foreword to my second book. All these guys talk about contribution, giving back. And the more you do it, the better you feel. It's great that you go in. By the way, they have a Defy program in Colorado. Are you in Colorado?
I'm actually in Los Angeles, but Defy Ventures is all over America.
Yeah, no, they invited me. I did one of their events in one of the state prisons here, because I do a lot of prison work, as you can imagine. So many times in places where I was incarcerated in the 80s and 90s, so it's always kind of fun to go back in that situation.
Only because you can go out the same day. Yeah.
I was down at the federal prison complex here in Southern Colorado, in Florence, Colorado. They have 4 big prisons there, and I was there in the late 90s. And second half of the 90s. And I went back there to speak one time, and they asked me if I wanted to go in my old cell house. And you talk about a trip, dude, walking in there and all the smells, guys washing their clothes in 5-gallon buckets. You can smell the Clorox. Guys are slamming dominoes. They're cooking ramens. I looked at the cop. I'm like, this isn't some kind of trick. Like, I don't have some kind of outstanding warrant. You guys are just trying to get me back in here and close the door behind me. But it was crazy, dude. And but no, the contribution, the work that you're doing with Defy, that's powerful stuff. I went in and did one of the Defy events. Must have been 50 or 60 guys there. And man, the enthusiasm, listen, prison is a hopeless place full of despair. But you walk in one of those Defy groups and you have enthusiasm, you have excitement, you have just energy, because they're so hopeful. Sure, you teach them how to be an entrepreneur, business skills and those kind of things, super important. But I'm telling you, man, as a guy who spent 13 years walking those yards, that when somebody comes in and gives you hope, like, holy crap, I might be able to make it out of this nightmare. And that's the number one thing. I go in, I talk about all kind of things with the guys. But the number one thing I want them to take away from me is, man, there's hope. If I just do the hard work, if I do the thing, things are going to work out. So I really appreciate, from a personal perspective, the work that you're doing. But that contribution, that's where you get to a point where I got to share this. I got to share this hope. I got to share this message. I got to share these books or whatever it is. And, of course, you make a living with it sometimes. Other times you do it purely for the contribution. I remember one time I kept getting letters from these guys at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. And it was a group of lifers, and they had read a couple of my books, The Power of Consistency and The Upside of Fear. And they were writing me letters like, come visit us. Please come visit us. And I'm like, dude, I can't just walk into your prison and knock on the door. Like, I got to be invited from the administration. Like, a week later, I get a letter from the assistant warden. Would you please come in and meet with these guys before they drive me crazy? So I went out to Nebraska and I spent a day with these lifers, and their mission was to find purpose in prison, knowing they're never getting out. But they found purpose, right? They found optimism. They found hope, and they were doing things to contribute by helping youngsters, and they're doing virtual digital stuff and teaching kids that come into prison. Powerful work from a group of people that, by all accounts, might not have any hope and purpose, and yet they had tons of hope and purpose. By the way, I got to add this. Just coincidentally, the next day after that meeting in Nebraska, I was in Memphis, Tennessee, speaking at FedEx headquarters to what they call their 5-star group. It's 200 of their top performers they bring in every year. They get to meet the CEO, have dinner with him, and blah, blah, blah. And I was speaking at that the next day. And the message that I had with the lifers and the message of FedEx was pretty much the same thing, little different context, but the message is universal. The principles are universal.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you still do it. I really appreciate it. I've actually been with the fire back into prisons where the people have actually spent time there, and
Yeah.
then 5 years later gone back to educate. So it
Yep.
is a great experience, and anyone out there should reach out to me because I'm
Yeah.
going again in March.
Hey, reach
Now,
out. Let's connect because I'd love to go in there with you sometime when I'm in California. If it works out date wise, to go in with you and talk to the fellas. I always really enjoy doing that.
perfect. We'll stay in contact on that, Weldon. Now, I don't want to wait until the end of this show to get people to follow you. By now, they should have got an idea of your passion, your perseverance, your strength, your ability. How can people best get a piece of Weldon in their life?
I think the easiest way is our website, weldonlong.com. It's WELDON, Weldon Long, LONG.com. And all our social media contacts are there. Links to books and resources, everything is right there. Pretty much our whole little world is right there. And of course, Amazon, if people are interested in the books and that type of thing.
All right, perfect. Okay, so those are going to be in the show notes, but make sure you get over to weldonlong.com, give him a follow, let him know you heard about him on this podcast. Now, you've mentioned a lot of great books and great people. How important are books to you in your growth?
Well, for me, they were critical because the first 7 years, I didn't have access to people like you to inspire me. I didn't have access to other successful people. I was alone in a prison cell. And by the way, rejecting kind of the prison lifestyle and all the games and all the BS, it's not really a popular thing to do in there, right? People think you're selling out, because you're reading books and trying to get your shit together. And so for me, it was critically important. It still is to this day. This is one of my favorites. I read this one almost every day. James Allen, The Mind is Master. See it there. One of my favorites. And right next to it, Stephen Covey. And right next to that is The Optimist Creed. Like, it's super important. For the first 7 years, I bet you, I don't know how many hundreds of books I read the first 7 years because I had nothing but time. By the way, was able to, education became something important to me. I don't think it's critical for success. I'm not saying that because I got a jailhouse degree, right? I went to jail, not Yale, as they say. But I got a GED, and there was a school in Southern California, in Santa Ana, California, that had a prisoner program. And for $25 a month, I could take classes on the condition that when I got out, I would repay all the tuition. So for 6 years, I studied at this Southern California for professional studies. And my mother would pay them $25 a month. Plus we had to buy the books. Was very fortunate that she and my grandmother helped out with that, and got a bachelor's degree and an MBA in management. And all of that was just like the education. I was in my 30s. I was so thirsty, man. I was so thirsty to learn. I studied history. I studied philosophy. I studied business and sales and mindset. Like, it's pathetic looking back, to be honest with you, Steve. I was 32 years old when I started this journey, and I was learning stuff. I took a class. I wanted to sign up for a college English course, and you have to write a 5-paragraph essay as preliminary test to get into the class. I failed it. I was so bad at writing that I couldn't write my grammar, my structure, all those things. I couldn't even do it. So they put me in a remedial English class, basic grammar. Today, I've written 3 books. One of them's an Amazon #1 bestseller. One's a New York Times bestseller. And one is Writer's Digest Best Book of the Year, right? A guy that couldn't even put 2 sentences together because I was thirsty. I studied. I learned. Before I read my first book, I read a book on how to write a book. I mean, there's education's out there everywhere. And I just became so thirsty for it. I was an idiot when I was young. I didn't understand the value of education. Again, I don't mean formal education. I'm not talking about a college degree. I'm talking about educating yourself about business, sales, mindset, history, understand what the hell's going on in the world. And so books are everything to me, everything.
I always say that I'm an educated individual, but school had nothing to do with it.
Bingo. That's so, a great
I'm a great believer in that. So there's been a number. I kind of want to find, and I'm trying to see how I can phrase this well. But strong people need strong actions, and even when we're stupidly strong, we need a strong action to realign us or reset us or readjust our trajectory. Do you ever consider looking back at your final jail time and going, "Whoa, hang on a minute. Maybe that's what I needed to get me to where I am"?
100%, Steve. Like, I look back at it. I don't have very many regrets in my life. I do have a few, but going to prison's not one of them. Like, that is what I needed. I needed that kind. Listen, I went to prison 3 different times. Like I didn't get it the first 2 times. I went for 4.5 years. Then I went back for 2 years and nothing changed. Nothing changed. And I'll tell you the reason nothing changed is because I didn't understand the power of my thoughts. I was trying to change my behavior. I mean, the first 2 times I got out of prison, the first thing I said is I'm never going back, right? I was determined to change my behavior. The problem is I wasn't changing my thinking. And as I learned that my thoughts were driving the behaviors, I realized that if I'm really going to stay out, I got to change my thinking first, then the behaviors. Stephen Covey used to say, if you want short-term change, focus on what you're doing. If you want long-term permanent change, focus on what you're thinking. And that was so powerful for me to understand that I got to change how I think, right? And for me, that's what it took. It took a 3rd time back to prison with my father dying. And as I mentioned, I don't have many regrets, but there are 2 related to prison. Number 1, I deeply regret that I could not be there for my father when he died, that I had lived my life in such a fashion that I gave up my right to be with my father on his deathbed. That's pretty pathetic. The other regret I have is that my son, who was 3 years old when I went back to prison that last time, his father was in prison. I was in prison for those 7 years. I didn't get out till he was 10. And I got custody of him right away. He's 30 years old now, but I got custody of him when I was 10. But during those 7 years I was gone, he was molested. He was sexually abused. He was exposed to pornography and drugs and alcohol at 7 and 8 years old. And it's had a huge impact. He's doing well now, but he's been through some tough years and self-loathing and blame and all those things that happen with victims of abuse and early exposure to drugs and alcohol. But so I regret that. I regret not being there because I like to believe that if I'd have been there, that shit wouldn't have happened. But I live with that. I live with my son's reality because I didn't have the good sense to stay out of prison. So I have that regret, and I regret not being there with my father. But everything else about my 13 years in prison was exactly what I needed.
Wow. Weldon, thank you for spending the time with us. I've got a funny idea we're going to be in contact a lot more. Again, easiest ways for people to get hold of you are?
WeldonLong.com, WeldonLong.com. That's WeldonLong.com.
There you go. If you didn't get it, 3 times as good. And look him up on Amazon. Grab the books. People think they're brilliant, so should you. Weldon, thank you very much for taking the time, but thank you very much for recognizing your dark places, but actually sometimes your silver lining.
Yep.
It's been a pleasure to get to know you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, brother. My pleasure.
Hey, I hope you liked that episode of the Art of Making Things Happen podcast. And remember, these are done for you. If you like them, subscribe, share them around. But if you don't like them, send me an email to ask@stevedsims.com and you can tell me what I need to do to make this the most dynamic podcast you listen to. Anyway, make sure whatever you learned from the last podcast, you actually do something with. Without action, it's just a bunch of people blowing air. Have a good time. Until next time. Bye.